and memory. And here's a study that does kind of the usual thing. And the old thing was to show what's wrong with children who are not normative. Why are they deficient? And this is one of those studies. Why can't they keep up with Bobby? And so Aaron Samplin did this in 2013, and it has both, though. You can look at it in that there are certain things I think maybe are even hinted at in this study that can be done. And if they happen, then the damage isn't so permanent. But that pathogenic model is happily outmoded. And here's a study coming from India that's one of the newer studies, even though it's one of the newer ones. Some of them are older in chronological year, but they're using the newer model. And this one shows that even in a low income and probably less optimal in terms of air quality and other things household, there are ways to build up that household so that the necessary nurturing and support happen in that household. And it's a very optimistic study from 2022 in Children magazine. And notice it's very much, they keep tracking it back to early childhood. So this is another study, and this one is a year older. Social support and hippocampal volume are negatively associated. That means less social support. If you have it, it's a good effect. If you don't have it, it's a bad effect. So negatively associated. And this even gives the ages, and I think you can read that too. Up until a certain age, we are building our little hippocampi, and then beyond that age, it's still coming up. It's still being built up and in volume, but apparently love creates a bigger hippocampus. Who knew? I'm happy to know that. So hug them every chance you get. Then we have the Greenberg study, and you can read that as well. The Greenberg study actually, as I recall, talks specifically about this. I'm going on a track here, the old model, the newer model, and then models that actually, and this is actually an older study, but it says some of these things that you can do to help build up the kinds of nurturing and social support and emotional regulation, impulse control. You know, this is something that gets children in a lot of problems in school. And if they don't have a lot of nurturing, they're always out there doing anything to make a big splash in the classroom. So, and sometimes that's a good thing, but if it gets violent, okay. Then finally, we have this 2023 study that was made into a book. And a lot of the arguments, really vicious arguments going on all the way back to the bell curve by Herenstein, I think his name was, in the 80s, that seemed to prove that African-American children on the bell curve were below par. And then everybody jumped all over him saying it's all bogus what he was doing. And that will never be probably resolved. It's one of those things that just got to be a buzzword. So the big arguments are over whether inborn genetic, the hand that we're dealt genetically is the only game in town, or whether how we are treated, what our environment is, it makes a difference in the epigenetics, how those genes work their way through our lives. And this man believes he's not taking either side. That's what's interesting. He said it's so both account for everything. So then we really don't have any free will at all, because he's taking a whole third path that between the genetics and the environment, there's not a lot left over. So immediately I got in touch with him. He's probably in great demand. He just gave a talk at Harvard, and he's at Stanford. But I go after them. I mean, all they can do is turn us down. So maybe we'll have him. You never know. And on to the next slide. What about science fiction? And how does it talk about all these things? So in no way am I giving you the more recent books. They're coming out all the time, but I'm using some of the classic ones up until recent, but I don't have a panoramic view of what's coming out. I just know that it isn't only in the fantasy realm, fantasy and horror. A lot of our young people have fled to that because they don't study science or science is not appealing to them. But even within science fiction, there's a lot of young adult and children's literature that definitely upholds people and gives them hope. So, who are the wonder kids that are the ones who are so resilient, that are the main characters? I tried to come up with some kind of a rubric, and what I figured out was it seems like some of them have gifts that they have in any case, and others have helpers from outside. And some of them, or maybe all of them, are a combination of both to some degree. So here we go. Children of the Atom, 1953. This was a very big, popular science fiction book at the time. And although the name of the writer isn't that familiar, not one of the big name science fiction writers. And this also fits in the genre of mutants. A lot of our wonder children get in science fiction, they get the term mutated or some kind of non-normative. And in this one, they are sort of like Spider-Man. They were created because their parents were caught in a blast in a nuclear facility, which is pretty timely for now, you know. They're brought together in a secret exclusive school, and the world doesn't understand them. I think they may have slightly different appearance too. And it's an interesting story. I think it reads as well today. You could read it today just as they read it in 1953. Not a lot has carried through very well. So people that felt like they were outsiders could identify with people like this. Even if they weren't recognized as brilliant, they could say, well, I know I have a lot of talent in me. They just don't recognize it. And it gives you something to lean on. You can carry this book around with you. Okay, so this one is much more recent. This is by a woman who's become a major, major name in science fiction. She's of Nigerian background in the US. She's an American writer. And I hope you could all read it. It's a novella. It's not even that long, maybe 96 pages. And Nnedi Okorafor is speaking. I signed up for I don't have the link with me, but I'll try to send it out to the group. She's talking at Harvard I think sometime in later February. But anyway, so she came from the very bottom and I'm talking in terms of place. Her home planet is really very deprived. And I thought it was funny. It opens up with the fact that they've got a rebuilt transporter beam that only works half the time. So it's funny. The opening is pretty funny. It's funny but sad. And so, but what you know about people who come from a deprived place is that they know how to fix things really well because they scour that landfill and get all that trash, and then they find parts of things that they can put back together. So she's very clever in those ways. And there's a thing, an old instrument. It's like an abacus that her people have used, and very few other people, even in Africa, used. And her people could use this thing, and I don't want to tell any more about it, but it's a scientific instrument. It's not magic. So here's one of the very, very important books in science fiction, and it created such a stir. And of course, like anything else in our culture, very few people know of it today. It's called Slan by A.E. Van Vogt. It's pronounced like, Castor Vogt. This person, this Slan, is someone who resonated like with the instrument, the theremin. It went all through the readers of science fiction. They all resonated with this Slan character. And it was very influenced by general semantics and how language works in our minds and creates realities. So once people recognize the power of rhetoric and language. They realize that we're being jerked around in all kinds of ways, and it gets right into your neurosystem. Language has neurological responses that are full-bodied, and half of which we are not even aware, no matter what very sophisticated culture critics like Noam Chomsky and people, he isn't even aware of some of the things that language does to him. It was S.I. Hayakawa who was discovering these language and your neuro system connections. And so people then became aware of it. They saw how people would get whipped up, and they would get whipped up in certain ways, and they realized Hayakawa was really onto something. And in his book, which was called Language in Action. And so this writer, A.E. Van Vogt, ran with that. And so he has these slans being people who are sort of a Superman type, who are aware, they're taught to be aware of all of these things and to use the powers of language and things to the point where they're really controlling a lot. They're kind of in advance, they're a vanguard or whatever, but people know that they're a little different. Again, they were non-normative, so they are not popular. And as I recall, I don't remember the book very well, but I don't think he's an entirely nice person either. And that makes him not the perfect person to identify with. But as it got into fandom, you can see there was a slogan, fans are slans. It went, they didn't have the term then, but it was all over in science fiction readership in the early 50s. And they even went so far as to set up some communal housing where men and women would live together without getting married. And they were called slan shacks. And people would, they were sort of the forerunners of hippie communes. And nobody knows about these things outside of science fiction these days. And these were people who in the 50s, which was a terrible, very repressive, conformist era, felt unloved, unappreciated. Often they were not the most fashionable looking. They didn't go a lot into self-presentation. They were the, excuse me, the intellectuals who had the glasses and often didn't take great care in their personal appearance. So they felt like they knew they were smarter than the people who were judging them, all the fashion plates out there. But they didn't have any way to express this, except that they knew they'd clumped together in these groups of science fiction fans. And boy, when slan hit, they had their little text, if you will, their template. It was sort of like the ones in the 60s that the hippies had their template, the Whole Earth catalog. Well, slan was this earlier one. And I just wanted to make this really highlight this because these were people who felt they had these potentials. They felt isolated and alone and had to maybe think, maybe I'm imagining it, that I have potential. But then when they found each other, that reinforced the idea that they did have potential. So there is a whole culture of science fiction fandom. And yet that culture has been half destroyed and modified when science fiction went out of this little closet of just a few readers and became a huge thing in mass culture. That changed the nature of fandom. So there are groups now at conventions that don't mingle with each other. And these fans who are the readers and who want much higher kind of cognitive level of science fiction are getting way outnumbered by the media fans. They call them media fans. So much to the point that there is a science fiction convention called ReaderCon that now niche markets these fans, these older fans that are maybe not as old as this, but they're readers primarily. They don't appreciate all the dumbing down that goes on in the film version of science fiction. And this ReaderCon is on the East Coast, and it gives an award every year called the Shirley Jackson Award. Shirley Jackson was the famous woman, and that wasn't actually science fiction. It was The Haunting, or The Haunting of Hill House, that a film was made from it. And it was a gothic ghost film, horror film of some variety, but very intellectual, very cognitive, high level, not much gore and violence in it. So Shirley Jackson also wrote The Lottery, which was probably the most popular story in the New Yorker ever. and it created a lot of anti-backlash. And the lottery got 400 hate mail letters when it came out, I think in 1948. I might be off by a year. But it was the biggest response to any fiction they'd ever had, probably still carries that uh, award. And so Shirley Jackson lit up the whole literary elite of New York and the East Coast. And then she made this other film that was made of her book, her novel, The Haunting of Hill House. It was called the film version with Robert Wise, I think he was the director. Um, that was made around 1962. Well, that certainly cemented her stardom. So she's considered one of the top female writers of horror or ghost stories, whatever. This one is sort of a very mixed, what you'd almost call an anti-hero if we were going to use the term hero, but I don't like it that much. So there's murdering of your nearest and dearest, not treating you well. Here's a person who's truly, you would think, damaged by the treatment that she has received. And it's a great story of coming around, working around it, and not being destroyed, not being put into a PTSD kind of mentality where you can't escape those thoughts, keep coming to you all the time of what happened to you. And I think for people who have been through something really dramatic and that would kill many people to be going through the kinds of obstacles that this protagonist goes through. It won the John W. Campbell Award for the best new writer, and that was in the year 2000. So I think some of these people get overlooked, even in the field of science fiction, and I haven't read it yet, but I intend to, believe me. Then we have at the other extreme, we have someone who is from the elite, the very top elite. And this is what, 1975, it's a bit older. So I wanted to show that there are obstacles. You know, it's like that Jacques Brel song, sons of the rich, sons of the poor, who's the child with no complaints. So anyway, this is the son of the rich. And he's the son of the rich who's got a problem. He's not perfect by their standards. And so you can sort of see the son of the rich there in his little throne. But he also wants to do better and wants to do something different. But because he's considered unfit, they're putting all kinds of walls around him and trying to keep him from achieving anything in his own society. So again, it's something worth reading. And so people who are non-normative are getting help through science fiction novels in various strata of society, coping with, you couldn't have two more polar extremes than that last story and this one, and yet they both have obstacles. And they both are not terrible people. They want to do something positive. And here's another one. This sounds like it was written last week by Kurt Vonnegut. This certainly follows almost the narrative of one of our factions in our discourse community and society today. There's one faction that feels we're doing way too much to bring about equality. And in a way, you could say this story can be used by those people. And I don't know what to say about that, except that it's what you would call a cautionary story, not to have what Hayakawa would say is a too valued thinking. You know, having total equality is good. Everything else we have to just get rid of because it isn't total equality. So that's very oversimplified, based in the amygdala of our brain, not at all nuanced thinking. And sometimes you can't do that because if you're cutting off people's potential at the lower, more obstacle laden end of society, you can't also cut off the potential of people who are a bit gifted. And there were so many controversies about tracking students in schools. And a lot of that's gone away because people just create private schools where they're all gifted. And so now we don't have so much of a big a buzzword in society about gifted tracking, but we have whole special schools for the gifted who are wealthier and have all the other advantages. So um, these are perennial problems, and they get handled in different decades, different ways. This was in the 80s when the rhetorical situation was that people were having schools that were more well endowed in certain parts of towns, and then they would have a big tracking system where the gifted would have a lot of extra enrichment activities. Other people saw this and then they wanted to put laws in. So it has its place. It does reflect the thinking at that time. Referent by Ray Bradbury is much older. And I didn't put the year, I think it was 1949. It came out in the Pulp magazine, Astounding, I think. And this is again out of that, the same movement that inspired SLAN, S.I. Hayakawa, Alfred Korzybski's General Semantics, also inspired Ray Bradbury. And he sets up a school where some of these people who've been taught by the general semanticists to understand how language creates reality, and language is always working on you in ways you don't know. And what they mean by language creating reality is most of what you can't see or touch is created out there for you, and you don't know if it's real or not. And some of it can be checked, and that's what he calls in the book language in action, the levels of abstraction, and that people, when they get into an extreme two-valued thinking, such as Stalinists and Nazis, they have no room for anything but these two values. He uses that, I'm referring to Hayakawa in the book Language in Action in 1940. He sets up a whole chapter about Stalinists and Nazis using this very simplistic two-valued thinking, and that means everything should disappear that isn't normative to either one of these or the other, and a lot of lumping goes on. So people came out of World War II, and then they brought out many editions of Language in Action. It was extremely popular right after the war because they recognized how rhetoric had caused people to think in these clumps, with their two values. And so Referent features a boy who's being trained not to do that, and yet he's not happy there. So Referent is the alien visitor who comes and gives him an opportunity to get out. So even among, I guess Ray Bradbury was critiquing this whole movement at the end of the war of general semantics. He wanted to let people know that even it has its own mind prison that you can fall into, because he was hanging around with the people who were big advocates like Robert A. Heinlein, A.E. Van Vogt, and there were others. I don't have a list of the names, but a lot of the big names in science fiction were big devotees of general semantics on through the 50s into the 60s and even into the 70s. So this is a whole movement that's there, and it's not very ascendant right now because Chomsky's kind of linguistics is currently getting a lot more play. But this is going to come back because we can now track how language affects our brains using fMRI. And that was the big weak spot in general semantics at the time, when Hayakawa said that language is such a creator of reality, and you can't even know what it's doing to your brain, because when I hear certain words, they make me clench my fist. And he said that several times. And people would say, but you can't measure it, can you, Hayakawa? You have no way to measure this so-called bodily effect of words on our brains. Well, now they can measure it. And I think we'll see more and more studies of how words are exciting different parts of the brain, which can now be isolated, like the hippocampus or the amygdala. That's the big one for the excitation. And so these stories will probably become models for new writers, because this is a I don't know what to say. It's a whole different way of looking at war, peace, how we develop, and how we know what we think we know. And it all goes back to this book, Language in Action. So I recommend it. Okay, and here's one of my favorites. I actually met this author who is now the late great Anne McCaffrey, and I met her in Toronto at the Fanfare 3, I think it was called. She was one of the keynotes there. I had no idea of her or what she was doing until that. And she was a trained opera singer. She didn't have a career in opera, but she had taken all training. So that's where the singing comes in her novels. Again, here we have probably some of the most extreme disabilities. These kids barely are viable, and they're very deformed in many ways, non-normative, and couldn't make it. So here's the option that she came up with in this wonderful novel. I'm rereading it at the moment. I don't want to, it's very hard. You have enough there, and if there's even another slide. So I don't want to say too much because then you won't think you need to read it. But read it because it's a wonderful, wonderful novel that has heart. It comes up with this novel thing. Everybody knows spaceships, but what about singing ones that give new hope to these children? And then the children are very important. They have control of a lot of the society. And they aren't unhappy. It sounds terrible, but they aren't unhappy. And so anyway, don't say any more. No spoilers here. Okay, so I don't know if this talk has given us any kind of insights or answers any questions about how determined we each are in terms of the hand that we're dealt by our genes and by our environment. But I hope that it at least asked some new questions and gave some new books that might be of interest. I should have put a picture of Language in Action by S.I. Hayakawa. Don't forget to check that one out. So what's coming up? Now I have a few moments because we didn't have another speaker. Our speaker next month is, gosh, his name is covered up. I know it's Robert Nguyen. There it is up on top. And he's going to be addressing us on tech giants on the screen because everybody's having big worries about AI and tech these days. So I hope you have time to look at his two videos. They're films, feature films, I think, or maybe they're series. I don't remember. One is called Devs and the other is called The Circle. And I thought I'd give you this preview because that gives you a chance. Sometimes it's hard to hear somebody and you don't even know the target text that he's analyzing. So here's about it. Devs it's a television miniseries, and it explores themes related to free will and determinism in Silicon Valley. I know I'm reading. Stop that, Gloria. Anyway, so that's Devs. The other one is The Circle. I'll just let you read that one. So that's Robert Nguyen, and it sounds like these again take up some of the issues of how much freedom we have, how much choice. And I hope you'll tell some of your favorite stories about resilient children. You can do it, those who didn't come live can do it in YouTube, but those who are here live, you can now tell me your favorite stories about resilient children, or maybe you've actually written a story about resilient children. So I think that's all there is. And I have to stop sharing. And there's everybody. So why don't we open this up to discussion? And just please unmute yourselves. Nobody's unmuting. Did I do something that you can't unmute?
No, I unmuted.
Oh, okay. Chris and Bob, everybody, Sybil.
There's some questions in the chat.
Oh, okay. Maybe people who couldn't, I'm going to find the chat now. Let's see, there's chat. Okay.
Oh, I just didn't know how we were going to proceed. So I had a question that wasn't too closely related to what you were talking about.
Mhm.
But I wondered if you knew why the New Yorker received so much hate mail regarding Shirley Jackson's The Lottery.
Oh, I could go on for another whole show on that because sure, I did a whole study of it.
Oh,
And
really?
yeah, I've done a lengthy study, reading the documents at the time, reading the letters, reading the editor's comments. And she had correspondence with her editor, I forget his name at the New Yorker. And what she was getting, and she even got personal letters direct, they found her. It was because, remember, this came out in 1948 and we were on a roll. We had won the World War II and we were the good guys. So I don't know if all of you know the story of the lottery, but
Yes.
what happens in the lottery? I'll do it just for people who haven't read it. It's a typical New England, very participatory, very democratic event that happens once a year when they run this little village lottery. And you don't know what the prize is or what the responsibility is that you get when you win the lottery. And it goes on and on with all the nice little things. And at the end, and I hope everybody has read it, but I have to tell you what it is anyway. The winner gets stoned by the rest of the people, especially the little boys. And you've been noticing there were plants in the story that they were putting little piles of stones, and you don't think anything of it because they're throwing them in the brook, the spring. Well, it shocked people in 1948. This was so obviously not in some terrible foreign place where we expect horrible things to be done by dictators. This was us. How dare she write this? How dare she stain our wonderful American, not only could be a city people do that, but not village people in New England. Come on. Of course, we know they had witch trials, and she was studying witchcraft and witch trials at the time. So people don't like that. They don't like their pretty places, their historic, their traditional places that are the sort of considered the heart of our American heritage, stained in this way, especially not after we've just won this terrible conflict. So she had people writing to her. And there were even people who wrote to her asking where they were having these events so they could go. They wanted to participate. Oh,
Oh,
anyway, and other people, many of the letters to the New Yorker, as part of their complaint, said they were canceling their subscriptions to the New Yorker because of Shirley Jackson. So I don't think it was enough that it worried them. And they thought, well, if she's getting this much attention, I guess the rule is usually anybody who generates so much attention probably has a lot more positive people they're not writing. And that was true. And they published a number of her stories after that, and she got offers for various kinds of book deals. And that's what really caused her fame to start, was the lottery. But it was over a lot of very violent backlash.
mm.
And today it's even more dangerous because people tend to carry it further than just words, or farther than just words. And so that does that answer what was going on?
Yes, yeah, yes.
Yeah.
I never knew that.
You have to look at each important text that gets a lot of attention, then look at the surrounding time, what was going on in that time, because if they don't resonate in a big way with the general uh, climate of the times, that's one of the main reasons why some books are picked up and others aren't. I'm reading another book called Distant Reading by Franco Moretti, who is doing computer-assisted studies of the rise and fall of genres of literature, like the Gothic novel, the Bildungsroman, and the well, detective genre novels. And what he's finding is certain things in the societies change, and then that causes certain genres of fiction to become more popular. And he's not analyzing each individual novel. He's looking at things that seem very strange, like the length of titles. Titles in the 18th century used to be 2 lines long, 30 words. And then he analyzes why they became shorter and how that relates to other factors. It's a fascinating, not that long a book, and it doesn't have terrible equations or anything. It does have charts and graphs, but This is what was going on. That helps you to contextualize what Franco Moretti is doing far more accurately than we have in the field of literary analysis.
Hmm.
And that's always helpful. It's like, the new historicism that writers, that students of literature were not allowed to use any historical context. That was forbidden under the close reading. You couldn't do that. All you could look at was the text, which was totally asinine, but it did carry the way for 30 years or more in the field of English. So
Yes, I remember.
now we are not doing that anymore. We're still close reading, but we're using the tools of, so we don't do anachronistic readings. That led to an awful anachronism because we didn't care what was going on. So the minute you add all that, you see how that explains why Shirley Jackson had that response, because we know what was going on then. And another thing someone brought up, and it hasn't been proven that this is what the lottery, what inspired it, but I think the lottery in the draft came in. It came in the same year as the lottery, the story. So, that there was some Congress renewed it, or I don't know how, I forget maybe the draft. I don't remember how the draft was done through World War II. Maybe it wasn't that kind of lottery, but whatever they did, it was something was done major to the system of the draft, and lotteries were in the news too in 1948. So that may have been a factor. And then there's another question. Is that enough on that one, or do you want to talk more?
No, that's good. And I didn't think about the um, issue of the draft in its relationship to the story, but that's an interesting thing to think about too.
Okay, well, we'll try to look at my chat again. There's the other one. Oh, Harlan Ellison, Bob is bringing up a story that actually made me sick to my stomach, and I couldn't sleep when I read it in whatever 1968 or whenever it came out. And it's a horrible story about someone who is drafted into being the brain of a machine. And he's been, what do you call it? Not vivisected, but augmented in ways that he loses control over his power to speak and everything, just because they need him to be the brain in this machine. So in other words, as much as Anne McCaffrey turns this into a positive story, this writer, Harlan Ellison, who's pretty well known within science fiction circles, wrote a terrible horror story about the same thing, being the living person in the core of some horrible machine. And it owes something to Franz Kafka's story. Is it In the Penal Colony, the one where the man has this thing inscribing on him?
Yes.
It's somehow related to that, where you're being acted on by machines and you can't get away, you're fixed in place, you're chained up or whatever. So, well, that's pretty much it. And what was it I was going to forward that I didn't remember to give you the link to? I said it earlier. Maybe the language in action, I'll put that in my notes. Just a fast note at the beginning of next month's announcements. And do you all have, now back to what I was asking, do you have your own favorite story of a strong young person who overcomes these terrible disabilities or disadvantages? Who has a story? Anybody? Well, it's hard. Maybe it's hard to think of it just, on the spot, but as you know, we put these up at YouTube. And so if you think of it tomorrow, that's always the thing. Oh, darn, I thought of it 2 days later. Well, you can certainly add it to the comments at YouTube when we get this thing up on our group, our club's channel at YouTube. Any other comments or announcements you want to make, or opinions, anything?
Well, I just have one question about how do you feel about the earlier fantasy children. I mean, because I read fantasy between the ages of 8 and 11. Then when I was 11, I started reading science fiction. Podkayne of Mars was the first science fiction book I ever read, which was Robert Heinlein. And I guess
Mhm,
Podkayne was a resilient child, I
mhm.
guess. But
Yeah.
the earlier books like Alice in Wonderland, in which Alice is very brave and capable and competent and able to deal with situations that adults wouldn't be able to, and then The Wizard of Oz, in which Dorothy is
Mhm.
very resilient, capable, and competent and able to deal with things that adults would not be able to deal with. Do you feel that those children, I know they're fantasy children and they don't have to do with real life experiences, but they inspired me when I was little and made me
Well,
feel like I could do
I
it.
was I was purposely sticking on science fiction because it gets less attention these days because there's such a bigger mass audience for fantasy and the other genres. So
Right.
yes, the answer is you're totally right. And there are one kind of a person, and not necessarily one of them is disadvantaged. The other one is definitely not disadvantaged. I'm thinking of circumstances.
Dorothy is
Yeah, she's
disadvantaged.
disadvantaged. Yeah.
Yes,
So there's something, I mean, with Alice, you have a child who has a lot of advantages. She goes somewhere, and with that self-entitlement of a child that had a lot of advantages, there's a big difference between the
that's
Dorothy
true.
and
Yes.
the Alice character. So, it takes some fine-tuning analysis to think which kinds of disadvantage so you don't leave people out. And I think that a lot of what's coming out and has come out in the meantime in fantasy certainly remembers that. You have urban fantasies where children are growing up in not, perfect rustic surroundings. So
Right.
they may also have physical disabilities and be picked upon by others. Neither Dorothy is picked upon, but there isn't anyone picking on Alice in the real world outside of her. They're at most they're kind of tolerating her, but they're not actively thwarting her all the time and picking on her and her family. So the one that's under the gun, so to speak, is Dorothy, where the woman is trying to take her dog, and there's questions about ownership of their farm, and
Well,
so
they're poor and it's the Dust Bowl
and it's the
and
depression.
depression. Yes,
So that was one reason that Baum wrote, I think, The Wizard of Oz to more
it
reflect,
was. Yes.
the people at, it wasn't the depression, it was so many years before that, but they had a big one in 1894 too. So we forget about that one, that depression. So there are differences, that things that change. I think the thing with fantasy is it tends to be more of a perennialist outlook, that these are the eternal verities, and it's just a slight difference in clothing and everything. Whereas with science fiction, it's deeper than that, that sometimes the fundamentals may change. In fantasy, it's only the updates of what's the dragon. And maybe the differences aren't as real when you really drill down into them. But one of the big claims of science fiction is that it is the one that's willing to change the whole rules, whereas fantasy will change the costuming and the fashions. But science fiction is an evolving thing coming out of a view that time changes things. There isn't one eternal anything, and we're changing as our universe may be, as our knowledge may be. So we don't have the final answers. I think it's more of a almost coming out of the religious traditions that fantasy usually has a worldview that's more universalist and perennialist. And that's a big generalization, but they don't emphasize novelty in the way that science fiction does, novelty and change.
Yeah, that's true. You're right.
And that if you grow up in different environments, one is more this is an unfounded perhaps thesis I have yet to develop. But I think children in very industrialized landscapes take to science fiction. Children who grow up in the more rustic, very rural places take to fantasy and medieval reenactment and everything. There's no way you could be a medieval reenactor in, some of our refinery cities or big industrial cities. And they still are going. That is kind of not true that it's all gone, and more of it may return to the industrial. But anyway, the children, it's what you see around you. And if you see big industrial things on all sides as you're growing up, maybe with some little parks and things, but they're a big factor. That makes you very aware that things are not eternal, that there's a lot of impermanence, there's a lot of change, things being torn down, newer technology coming in right in your neighborhood, right in your city. It's ongoing all the time, and you're seeing it as a child all the time. How can that not affect you? And so
Yes.
I remember growing up in East Chicago, and I would see these, they were like igloos. The igloos that were something to do with the oil industry in Whiting. And they would have steam in the very cold weather, clouds of steam hugging the ground around them, and all these twinkling little electric lights all outlining them. And you'd be going on the bus or something, and you'd see this out the window, and it looked like Venus. It looked like those dome cities in Venus, on Venus. So I could easily envision Venus, or more Venus because of the clouds. It didn't look like Mars to me, but when it was dry in daytime, it could be Mars. So that's what I'm saying. For me, it would have been a bigger stretch to do medieval or fantasy things out in green pastures where people are living in the forest. We were definitely Mordor, the people of the cities. And I think that may have been intended by J.R.R. Tolkien, that the people in the cities lived in Mordor. But I didn't mind it. I never liked Tolkien that much. But I knew you kind of have this feeling which group you are. And so some of the things, they have a definite audience, a definite readership in mind, and it's not accounted for because that would be considered class-based literary criticism, and that's very frowned upon, to put it mildly. So, but you just grow up knowing what you know. And so I don't know how to write about this and not fall into that trap of it being some kind of class-based literary critique. But I guess you could start from your own experiences and interview others and see if other people had those feelings as well. I just know that a lot of the people I met who were really big into science fiction were also big city people. And they found a lot of this surroundings of their man-made buildings and structures around them. Isaac Asimov, for instance, was agoraphobic. He refused to travel more than, I don't know, wherever he could get in a few hours on the train. He never went on planes. He refused to be on planes. So he was such a big city person that he didn't see the point. His wife made him move to a small town in Massachusetts, and he was basically a New Yorker and like living in a hotel. When he had as much money, he could have had a house anywhere. He still lived in a hotel in New York. So I see we have a newcomer. I hate to break the news, Margaret, but you missed the whole slideshow. But don't despair, Margaret, because it's going on YouTube. So this is Margaret, one of our people from Tucson, everybody, if you wonder where she's coming in from.
Sorry I'm so late.
Oh, that's okay. It happens. Anybody else, like Sybil, if you can type into chat, I can answer questions in chat, even if you can't speak. I see you're still muted.
Okay. I'll see what I can do. I'm looking at the bottom here and not getting the options that I usually do. So.
Okay. Well, since you didn't see the talk, but you can ask general questions if you have something, or make a comment in general about genre theory. Oh, here's Sybil. Yeah.
There we go. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Well, I have an answer for Sybil, another happy, good news answer, Sybil. You will be able to watch it on YouTube and you won't have missed anything. So
Thank you.
there wasn't much visual anyway. I just had pictures of the book covers. So you got 75% of it without maybe the part in the beginning where we had the pictures of the hippocampus and the brain.
Thank you.
So anyway, are there any other, I don't want to drag this on. I know people have things to do on Saturday. But I find it very interesting, this genre theory that children of cities do have a different, many of them do read science fiction. Oh, thank you, Sybil. Well, we were thrilled to have you. And Sybil is from my film discussion group up in Chicago, North Side. And we also had input, by the way, and I should mention this and credit her, from Judy Mizrahi from that same film group. She is a therapist and she apologized. She said a lot of things were going on. She probably would have come, but she did look at the not script, the PowerPoint slideshow, and she noted all these studies that I was looking at, and she came up with a video. And I will, oh, Judy has a painter doing her house. Anyway, so I will share with those who came the link that's Judy Mizrahi sent me to. It's something that man who wrote the book Determined is talking to another very important, I guess, therapist. So right after I get off here, I will send you the link that Judy Mizrahi sent me to that. It's a 2-hour talk with the man who wrote Determined, and it should be very informative. Because again, what it devolves to in the case of these children is, are they totally limited by the limiting factors, or is there a plus factor, an X factor? And according to Mr. Sapolsky, or Professor Sapolsky, there is no plus factor. I find that a bit disturbing myself, but maybe it just means he thinks we can account for 100% of everything if we go environment plus genes. And then there's nothing beyond that. We're always like little robots acting on the commands of our environment plus genes. So he's not taking a side there, but he is taking a side that there's no plus factor called mind or spirit or anything outside of that. He's actually reenacting in a more updated way the claims of the behaviorists who only took the side of the environment. Skinner, B.H. Skinner was the leader of that bunch, but he's doing it with 2 factors instead of 1. And yet it comes to that same point that he says there's no mind there directing the show. There's just environment and genetics. And that's plenty to chew on. And if we can entice him and trap him into coming, I'm sure we'll have plenty of other questions to ask him about that, because this is a very strong claim, a strong theory that it harkens back to the behaviorists who thought they could explain everything. Pavlov was another one. Oh, Bob has a comment about the World War II draft. So I did read your other comments. He's commenting in the background. Let me see, trying to get into chat. Okay, so Bob has a comment. The World War II draft, I think it was not a lottery like in Vietnam. Everyone was drafted but rejected for various causes like essential services, medical, or CO. Earlier, Bob he made a bunch of comments. I'll have to go back, and I did read the Harlan Ellison one, Bob. He mentions the Wonderful Flight to the Mushroom Planet, which was my favorite science fiction book when I was 9 years old. And that is still science fiction, but barely, And then Bob mentioned, he has another comment, supersonic saucer about UK kids who befriended an abandoned child alien who has superpowers and helps the kids and gets everyone into trouble. And Bob says it's the uncredited, which should have been credited, little known precursor to Spielberg's E.T. So you can look that up. I think that's a video, a film. Isn't it a film, Bob? Okay. Yeah, so if you look up Supersonic Saucer on YouTube, you can watch this film and you will see that in many plot points, it's a perfect template for ET. And that falls into the category of all the things that Rod Serling took and didn't credit from Ray Bradbury, or at least that Ray Bradbury claimed were taken and not credited. So these things may never be decided. There's probably some rule of thumb how much of it has to be a total match before it's considered plagiarism or goes beyond just, it could be an unconscious influence. How do we know when we're writing a new script? Sometimes you may have forgotten this earlier script, this earlier video. In those days, it would have been film. And you don't credit it because you're not remembering it. And this is how the brain works. And then someone who wrote the thing recognizes it and then accuses you of plagiarism. So, and then you'd have to prove that your unconscious was the plagiarist and not your conscious mind. And that's very difficult to do. So anyway, that's a good one, Bob. Oh, another new message. Maybe it's from Bob. Let's see who it is from. Where's my new messages? Oh, he may have bought the rights. Who is he? Spielberg, I guess you mean. Oh, sure. We'd have to do, read up on the making of ET to find out if that was done legal ways or if it's just an uncredited source. So again, sometimes the gifted one is not a person from Earth at all. We had a speaker in, I believe it was October. What was their first name? Gosh. Leah Sipish, Cypss, Cypus. I forget how to pronounce her last name. Leah Cypus. And she had a great story in FNSF, Fantasy and Science Fiction, called As Blue as Blood. And here we had the super being a child who was enhanced by these crustaceans. Her parents were anthropologists, medical anthropologists on a planet that Earth was trying to establish better relations with or some kind of agreements with. They spend several years there. This child is born there, but she has a terrible blood-borne disease, hereditary disease. And it turns out the crustaceans can modify their blood to be crustacean-looking beings, can modify their blood. They're in advance of Earth science. And so they have this technique of modifying their very different blood to be compatible with Earth people's blood. And she would die if she didn't get something that was in their blood. So she gets this huge transfusion of this this alien blood. And the only thing about them is that they cannot tolerate the color blue. It's something about their sky, the color of their sky, and on their planet, nobody can live with the color blue. So they have to return to Earth after their money runs out for their grant. And that's a good story. It's called As Blue as Blood. So there's a child who definitely benefited from the contact with these very different aliens. And think how that plays out in a subconscious level on children who read that versus, oh, anybody different is bad. And this is kind of the going mentality. So it puts you in a very alternative culture to be reading, oh, but look, they can be good in this way. Oh, they can be advanced ahead of us. Oh my goodness. And so growing up on that, you don't grow up in that. But it depends. But there's the other military science fiction that upholds in many times that other mentality that we're the best and others need to be blasted, so you got to be honest about these things. There's more than one type of science fiction. I don't have anything else, and I think this has been a very, very productive discussion. And I guess I should just leave it there. We're at 10:13, and that's a reasonable time. So any other final comments, anybody? Okay, well, I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you all for coming, and it will be up on YouTube, and share it widely because this is a topic I think a lot of people care about.